There is a version of this story where a library does not burn. That is the whole of it in the end. Not a battle won, not a villain defeated, not some hidden power that changes the shape of the world. Just a single afternoon on a small island in the West Blue, where a fire that historically consumed everything, every book, every scholar, every last person who knew a truth the world had spent 800 years trying to erase, simply does not get lit. Tonight we are going to sit inside that afternoon slowly, and then we are going to follow the quiet, enormous difference that one unburned library makes to a little girl, and to her mother, and to a secret the most powerful people alive would kill an entire island to keep. Somewhere in the West Blue, in this telling, the island of Ohara lives. Everything after that is new ground. Walk gently so you can rest while you walk it. Settle in wherever you are. Let the weight of the day start to leave your shoulders. Let your breathing slow to match the pace of a voice that isn't in any hurry to get anywhere. There is nothing here you need to remember and nothing you need to hold on to. If a name drifts past too quickly, let it drift. If you're asleep before we ever reach the part where everything changes, that isn't a failure. That's the entire point of this. I'll keep talking either way. Think of tonight less as a story you have to follow, and more as a very old, very quiet library that you're allowed to lie down inside, with someone in the corner turning pages softly so that you don't have to. Before we can talk about the afternoon that changes, we have to walk carefully through the afternoon that actually happened, honestly, without softening it, because the weight of the imagined version only means anything if the real one is sitting right beside it, unaltered, close enough to touch. So we begin in the world as it truly was, not as it might have been, as it was. And the world as it was is one where this library burned and everyone in it died, and the little girl who survived spent the next 20 years being told by nearly everyone she ever met that she should never have been allowed to live at all. To understand why an island of gentle scholars and librarians became something the most powerful government in the world decided to erase from existence, you have to understand what they were actually studying and why it terrified people who were otherwise afraid of almost nothing. There is, in the history of this world, a gap, a hole, deliberately cut. Somewhere around 800 years before the present day, there was a stretch of roughly 100 years that simply does not appear in any official record anywhere on the seas. No histories of it survive. No monuments name it. It is not that these years were quiet or unimportant. It is that someone at the end of them went to enormous and violent lengths to make sure they would never be spoken of again. Historians call this erased stretch the void century, because that is all it is allowed to be. A void, a blank, a silence where 100 years of human life used to be. The people who erased it were the ancestors of the organization that still rules most of the world today, the world government, an alliance of kingdoms that traces its own founding to the very end of that silent century, to whatever happened in the war that closed it. And that is the heart of the whole matter, the thing worth holding on to even as the rest drifts by. A government that came to power at the end of a war it will not let anyone remember has a very good reason to keep that war forgotten. Whatever was true during those 100 years, whoever won and whoever lost, and what the losers believed, and what was destroyed to make the winning permanent, all of it is a threat, simply by existing, to the story the current rulers tell about why they deserve to rule. So the truth of the void century became the single most forbidden thing in the world. Not a weapon, not a treasure, a history, a set of facts about the past that the present cannot survive being widely known. But you cannot erase everything, scattered across the world, in a script so ancient that almost no living person can read it. There survive a small number of enormous, indestructible stone cubes covered in carved characters. They are called Poneglyphs. Whoever made them, and that too is a mystery the world has never solved, made them precisely so that some truths could not be burned, or smashed, or drowned, or forgotten, no matter how badly the powerful of any age might want them gone. The Poneglyphs are the memory of the world, written in stone that outlasts empires. And the world government, unable to destroy them, did the next best thing. It made reading them a crime punishable by death, not studying them casually, not admiring them as old art. Reading them, understanding what they say. The mere act of recovering the truth those stones preserve is, in the eyes of the people who rule this world, the gravest offense a person can commit. Graver than piracy, graver than murder, graver than open rebellion. Because piracy and murder and rebellion threaten the government's power. Reading the Poneglyphs threatens the government's story about why it should have power at all. And to the people at the very top, those are not the same thing, and the second one is far, far more dangerous. Hold that in your mind softly as we go. In this world, the most forbidden thing a person can do is simply to know the truth about the past. And on one small island, a community of the gentlest people imaginable had spent generations quietly, patiently, lovingly doing exactly that. That island was Ohara, and at its heart stood something worth picturing slowly. Because it is one of the most beautiful places in the entire story, and because in the real history it does not survive the day we are building toward. Ohara was a small, unremarkable island in the West Blue, the kind of place the wider world had no particular reason to notice. And rising out of the middle of it was a tree. But calling it a tree undersells it the way calling the ocean a puddle would undersell the ocean. The tree of knowledge was vast, ancient, taller than any building most people would ever see, its trunk wide enough to hold rooms and staircases and galleries inside it, and it had been hollowed and built into over centuries, until it was less a tree with a library in it than a library that happened to be alive, still growing, still putting out leaves over the heads of the people reading beneath it. Inside were books beyond counting, the accumulated written memory of the world, gathered and protected and studied by generation after generation of archaeologists who had made Ohara the greatest center of learning left anywhere in the seas. And the people who tended it were, by every account, kind. That is worth dwelling on, because it makes what happened to them so much heavier. These were not revolutionaries plotting to overthrow anyone. They were not warriors or spies or agents of some rival power. They were scholars, bookish, curious, absent-minded, gentle people who loved old languages and forgotten histories, the way some people love their own children, people whose idea of a thrilling afternoon was deciphering 3 more characters of a text nobody had read in centuries. They wanted, more than anything else in the world, simply to know, to fill in the blank, to recover the 100 years the world had lost, not to use it as a weapon, not to blackmail anyone or topple any throne, but because they were archaeologists, and a deliberately erased century is the single most irresistible thing an archaeologist can imagine. A locked room at the center of all history with a sign on the door that says, "Do not look inside." At the head of these scholars stood Professor Clover, an old man, white-bearded, patient, the kind of teacher who had spent a lifetime being gentle with difficult questions and difficult students alike. He led the archaeologists of Ohara, and he understood, better than most of them, exactly how dangerous their work was. Because Ohara had done something no other place in the world had managed to do. Somewhere on the island, hidden, the scholars had gathered and studied actual poneglyphs, and over long years of painstaking effort they had learned to read the ancient script. And they had gotten close, closer than anyone was ever supposed to get. They had begun, piece by piece, to reconstruct the shape of the void century itself, to glimpse the outline of the very thing the world government had spent 8 centuries making sure no one would ever see again. They did it quietly. They did it knowing it was forbidden. They did it anyway because they were scholars, and the truth was there to be found, and someone, they believed, ought to remember. Among all these grown archaeologists, there was one child, a small, dark-haired, blue-eyed girl of 8 years old named Nico Robin. And Robin was, even at 8, already one of them. Already a scholar, already able to read the ancient script that most of the adults on the island had spent decades struggling with. A prodigy so far ahead of her years that she had earned her archaeologist's credentials younger than anyone in Ohara's long history. You would think that would have made her beloved. It did not quite. Robin was a lonely child. The other children on the island were frightened of her, partly because she was strange and serious, and buried in books when they wanted to play, and partly because of something she could do that they could not. Robin had eaten a devil fruit, the hana no mi, which let her make copies of her own limbs bloom from any surface, an arm sprouting from a wall, eyes opening on a tree trunk. And to children who did not understand it, that looked less like a gift than like something out of a nightmare. They called her names, they kept their distance, and the adults, kind as they were busy with their work, and did not always notice a small girl sitting alone at the edge of things, reading, waiting for someone to want her company. There is one more piece of Robin's loneliness worth naming because it makes everything that follows land harder. Her mother was not there. Robin's mother was a woman named Nico Olvia, herself a brilliant archaeologist. And years before the events we are walking toward, Olvia had made an almost impossible choice. She had left Ohara, left her very young daughter behind, to join a research expedition that would sail the world studying the true history at sea, chasing the void century across the oceans in a way that could not be done from the safety of one island. It was the kind of choice that looks like abandonment from the outside and like devotion from the inside, and it was probably both at once. Olvia went to sea to help recover the truth the whole world had lost. And little Robin grew up on Ohara without her, told that her mother was out there somewhere doing something important, carrying the specific ache of a child who has a mother she cannot remember the face of, waiting for a return that kept not coming. So picture her, before any of the rest of it begins, an 8-year-old girl, the most gifted scholar on an island of scholars, lonely among children who feared her and adults who loved her but rarely saw her, reading the forbidden history of the world in a library grown inside a living tree, with a mother somewhere out on the sea and an empty place at her side where a friend should have been. That is Nico Robin at the beginning. Remember her that way because the whole weight of tonight rests on what the world does to that child, and on the single afternoon where, in this one telling, it doesn't. Into that loneliness, not long before the end, came a giant. His name was Jaguar D. Saul, and he arrived on Ohara the way large, unexpected things sometimes arrive in a child's life. Suddenly, enormously, and entirely by accident. Saul was a giant, one of the towering people who stand tall enough that a grown man comes up to somewhere around their knee, and he had washed up near Ohara after a shipwreck, exhausted and stranded. But he was not only a giant. Saul had, until very recently, been a Marine, and not a low-ranking one, but a vice admiral, a senior officer of the very government that would soon come for the island. He had walked away from all of it. Near the end of his service, he had been handed an order he could not carry out, could no longer stomach what the Marines did in the name of justice, and rather than obey it, he had deserted. And now here he was, a runaway giant with a soldier's past, hiding on a small island of librarians. Exactly what that final order had been and who it had concerned is something we will come back to in a moment, because it ties this giant to the little girl in front of him more closely than either of them yet knows. The person who found him was Robin, and what happened between them over the short time they had is one of the tenderest things in the whole story, and one of the cruelest to lose, because it is the first time in the entire life we have been describing that this lonely little girl is simply, uncomplicatedly wanted. Saul did not find her strange. He did not flinch at the arms that bloom from walls, or the seriousness, or the books. He was a big, warm, slightly ridiculous person, and he treated the small, serious scholar in front of him not as a prodigy to be impressed by or a nightmare to be wary of, but as a kid, a lonely kid who could use a friend, which was exactly what she was underneath all the credentials. He hid, and she brought him food and kept his secret, and in return he gave her something none of the adults, busy and kind as they were, had managed to give her, his full, delighted attention. And he taught her to laugh. This is the detail that matters most, so let it land softly even if everything else drifts away. Robin, at 8, had more or less forgotten how, or perhaps never really learned, a child that lonely and that serious. And Saul, who laughed in a strange, distinctive, honking way, all dereshishishi, told her that no matter how bad things got, a person should always be able to find a way to laugh from the heart, because somewhere out there, he promised her, was a whole sea full of people who would be glad she was born. And one day she would find them, and she would sail with them, and she would laugh with them for real. He said it the way you say a thing to a child to give them something to hold on to in the dark. He could not have known how much dark was coming or how long she would have to hold on to it. There is an old thread woven quietly through this whole world, attached to certain rare people who carry the initial D in their names. Saul was one of them, Jaguar D. Saul. And it is said that those who carry that letter have a strange, stubborn capacity to laugh even in the face of their own death. Saul was teaching Robin, without either of them fully understanding it, how to be the kind of person who survives. He had one old friend from his Marine days worth mentioning now because he becomes important very soon. A fellow officer named Kuzan, a tall, lazy-seeming, oddly gentle man with a power over ice, who would later rise to become one of the most powerful admirals in the entire Navy under the name Aokiji. Saul and Kuzan had served together, had respected each other, had the kind of bond that soldiers form, and that does not entirely dissolve just because one of them walks away. Hold that friendship in the corner of your mind. In the real history, it is the thin thread on which a little girl's entire survival ends up hanging. Because while Saul was hiding on Ohara and teaching Robin to laugh, the machinery of the government was already turning toward the island, and it had been turning for a long time. Remember Olvia, Robin's mother, out at sea with her research expedition. That expedition had been caught. The Marines had captured Olvia and her fellow scholars, and under interrogation, the truth had come out. Where they were from, what they had been studying, that there was an entire island devoted to reading the forbidden history. That was the thread the government pulled. That was the moment Ohara stopped being a secret the scholars had managed to keep and became a target the most powerful people in the world had decided to erase. And here is the connection the little girl and her giant friend could not possibly have guessed at. The answer to that final order Saul had refused. The Marine officer who had been set over Olvia's captured expedition, the senior man ordered to break those gentle scholars and see the matter through, was Saul himself. And he could not do it. Sickened by what he was being told to do to a woman and a group of academics whose only crime was wanting to know the truth, he set Olvia free with his own hands and deserted rather than carry out the order. And then, adrift and hunted himself, shipwrecked near a small island he had no way of knowing was her home. The runaway giant hiding in Robin's care and the mother racing across the sea toward her were bound together, without either child or mother realizing it, by the same single act of mercy. Saul had freed them both, in a sense, the day he refused. Olvia, released, did the only thing a mother in her position could think to do. She ran for home. She set out for Ohara across the sea to warn her island, and after all those years away, to finally see the daughter she had left behind before the end she could feel coming arrived. So everything was converging on one small island at once, in the real history. A runaway giant teaching a lonely girl to laugh, a mother racing home across the water carrying a warning and 20 years of guilt. And behind both of them, closing fast, an overwhelming government force with orders that were about to escalate from arrest into something the world had a special, terrible name for. The pieces were all in motion. In the real history, they land in the worst possible arrangement. Tonight, in a little while, we are going to change exactly one of them. But not yet. First, we have to let the real day happen, all the way to the end, because you cannot feel the mercy of the imagined version until you have sat with the full weight of the true one. The government's force reached Ohara, led by a man named Spandine, an official of the government's shadowy intelligence division, the sort of small, cruel, self-important functionary that vast and merciless systems always seem to produce in abundance. A person given enormous power he had done nothing in particular to deserve and enjoyed using. With him came agents and marines, and waiting out on the water, a fleet. Saul saw them coming first, from the shore, and understood immediately what it meant, because he had once been a senior officer of exactly this kind of operation and knew what that many ships gathering around one small island was the prelude to. He tried to get Robin to safety, he tried to get the scholars to run, but the scholars would not run. This is one of the quietly heartbreaking things about Ohara, and it tells you everything about who these people were. When the agents came, when it became clear that the government had found them and that the price of their forbidden knowledge was about to come due, the archaeologists of Ohara did not flee, and they did not fight. They gathered in and around the tree of knowledge, and their overwhelming concern, the thing they moved to protect, the thing they could not bear to abandon, was the books, the history, the accumulated memory of the world that they had spent their whole lives guarding. They were librarians to the very end. Faced with their own destruction, what they thought about was whether the knowledge would survive them. It is an almost unbearably gentle thing to be in the face of that much force. Olvia reached the island in the middle of all this, reached home at last after all those years at sea, into the middle of the raid she had raced to warn them about. And somewhere in the chaos, she and Robin found each other. Picture that, and how impossible it is. A mother and a daughter meeting for essentially the first time either of them can remember on the worst day of their lives, with the world ending around them. There was almost no time. There was a moment, a look, a few words, an 8-year-old finally seeing her mother's face, and a mother finally seeing how her daughter had grown. And then it was already being torn away. Olvia had not come home to stay. She had come home to warn them, and if it came to it, to die with them and to make sure her daughter did not. Inside the tree, the agents were searching, and they found the thing that turned everything from bad to final. Hidden on the island in a secret chamber was the scholar's most advanced work. The actual Poneglyph research, the evidence of exactly how far Ohara had gotten, proof that these gentle librarians had not merely dabbled in the forbidden history, but had genuinely begun to read it, to reconstruct the void century, to recover the one thing the world government could not allow to be recovered. The moment that hidden research was discovered, the scale of the response was no longer in question. This was not a matter of arresting some over-curious academics anymore. This was, in the government's eyes, a containment failure of the highest possible order. The most forbidden knowledge in the world had very nearly been pieced back together on one small island by people who could read the stones. And there is only one thing a power built on a lie does when it discovers that someone has very nearly proven the lie. Professor Clover made one last attempt to do something with the moment, the bravest and most hopeless thing in the whole sequence. Using the agent's communication snail, he got a line through to the very top of the world government, to the 5 ancient men who sit at its summit, the 5 elders, the highest authority in the world. And instead of pleading for the island or begging for mercy or denying anything, Clover did the most scholar thing imaginable. He tried to tell them the truth. He began to lay out, calmly for the most powerful people alive, his theory of why they were really doing this. Why the government had spent 800 years and was now about to spend an island's worth of lives keeping the void century buried. He had worked it out. He had followed the evidence to its conclusion, the way a scholar does, and he began to explain that the reason lay in a certain kingdom that had existed during those erased years, a kingdom whose name, whose ideals, whose very memory the government could not allow to survive, because that memory threatened the entire foundation of their rule. And before he could speak the name of that kingdom, before the single most dangerous word in the world could leave his mouth and travel down that line, he was shot. Point blank in the middle of his sentence, mortally wounded, silenced. The 5 elders would not even let the name be spoken aloud on a phone line to themselves. That is how dangerous the truth of the void century is. Not dangerous enough to argue with, dangerous enough that the men at the top of the world would rather shoot a defenseless old scholar mid-sentence than risk hearing him finish. Clover fell, the name went unspoken, and the order came down from Mary Joyes, from the 5 old men at the summit of everything, cold and final, erase the island. All of it, everyone on it. They gave that order a name. They called it a buster call. A buster call is the single most destructive thing the world government can bring down on a place. It is not a battle, and it is not an arrest, and it is not a punishment in any sense that leaves anything behind to be punished. It is an erasure. A fleet of warships and a group of the Navy's most senior officers converge on a single target and bombard it methodically from every direction until there is nothing left. No buildings, no landmarks, no island, no people, nothing but open water where a place used to be. It is designed to be total. It is designed so that afterward no one could stand on the spot and even know that anything had ever been there. When the 5 elders called a buster call down on Ohara, they were not ordering the island defeated. They were ordering it deleted from the world, so completely that the truth its scholars had almost recovered would go down with it, unspoken, unfinished, drowned. And so the ships opened fire, and Ohara, the small, unremarkable island, the great living tree, the greatest library in the world, and everyone who loved it, began to burn. The scholars died in the fire, and they died as who they were. even at the end, even as the shells fell and the tree of knowledge caught and the flames climbed through 800 years of accumulated memory, their concern was the books. They tried, impossibly, to save what they could of the history. They chose their treasures, not gold, not their own lives, but knowledge, right to the last second. And the fire took them and the knowledge together. The greatest library in the world burned to the waterline with its keeper still inside it, still reaching for the pages, and the world lost in a single afternoon a store of truth it can never rebuild. Olvia died there too. She had reached her daughter, had that one impossible sliver of a reunion, and then she made the same choice her fellow scholars made, and the choice a mother in her position makes. She stayed. She turned to Saul, the one person who could carry her daughter to safety, and she gave Robin to him, and she told him to save her, to get her off the island and away, to give the little girl the future the rest of them were about to lose. And then Olvia turned back toward her burning home and her dying friends and did not run, because she had come home to die with them and to buy her daughter a life with her death. And that is exactly what she did. Robin, 8 years old, was carried away from her mother for the last time, watching the only home she had ever known come apart in fire and her mother choose to vanish into it. Saul tried to get her out. He was a giant, and giants are strong beyond the scale of ordinary force, and for a few moments it looked as though sheer size and fury might be enough. Enraged at what was being done, at the child in his hands and the island at his back, he struck out at the marine ships, and he sank several of them, a lone giant standing against a fleet. But a buster call does not send ordinary sailors, it sends the Navy's best. And the officer who came to stop Saul was his own old friend, Kuzan, the man of ice, the fellow soldier from his marine days. They faced each other on that shore, the deserter giant and the admiral he had once served alongside, and Kuzan did what he had been sent to do. He froze Saul solid, turned the enormous, warm, laughing giant into a statue of ice, mid-motion. For more than 20 years afterward, everyone who knew of that day, Robin most of all, believed that was the end of him. And here the thin thread held, just barely, and it is the only reason there is a Nico Robin to tell any of this about. Because Kuzan, having frozen his old friend, turned to the little girl Saul had just been frozen trying to save. And he could not quite do it. Whatever justice he had been sent to carry out, he could not bring himself to extend it to the child. So he did something halfway, something that was not mercy exactly and not duty exactly, but some cold compromise between them. He made her a small boat, and he froze a path across the sea for it, and he sent her away. Alone, 8 years old, off into open water. And he told her, in a voice with no warmth in it at all, that he was not her friend, that he was doing this because Saul had been his friend once and for no other reason, and that if she ever became a criminal, if she ever gave the government cause, he would come for her himself. That was the whole of the kindness the world could spare for Nico Robin on the day it murdered everyone she loved. A cold man's half-hearted exception, a boat, a warning, and a laugh. Because Saul, freezing, laughed even as the ice took him, the way he had taught her to, the way those who carry the D are said to laugh even at the end of everything, so that the last thing the little girl saw of her giant friend was him keeping the one promise that mattered, showing her how to survive a thing that should not be survivable. Then Ohara was gone, erased from the maps, struck from the record, an island that officially had never existed. And a small dark-haired girl drifted away across the sea in a little boat, entirely alone, the sole survivor of the greatest crime the world government had committed in living memory, carrying inside her the forbidden knowledge they had killed 1,000 people to bury, with a bounty already being drawn up in her name. What the world did to that girl afterward is the part that makes the whole thing unforgivable. And it is worth telling before we change anything because it is the exact weight the imagined version lifts. They put a bounty on her, not a small one and not later when she had grown into someone dangerous. Immediately, while she was still 8 years old and drifting alone in a boat. 79 million, an enormous sum, the kind of bounty reserved for serious, established criminals, placed on the head of a child who had done nothing but survive. They dressed it up, of course. The official charge was that she had destroyed marine battleships, the ships that Saul, not Robin, had sunk in his final rage. But the fabrication fooled no one who mattered and was never really meant to. The true reason was the one thing the government could never print on a wanted poster, She was the last person alive who could read the forbidden history. She was the containment failure that had gotten away. As long as Nico Robin drew breath, the truth of the Void Century had a living mind to survive in, and so the most powerful government in the world decided that an 8-year-old had to die, and told every bounty hunter and marine and opportunist on every sea that there was a fortune waiting for whoever made it happen. And so began 20 years of a childhood and a young womanhood spent entirely on the run. Think about what that actually means day to day for a person. Nico Robin could never stay anywhere. She could never trust anyone because trusting someone was the fastest way to be sold. She learned this over and over in the cruelest possible ways. A kind-seeming woman who took her in and then turned her over for the reward. A couple who seemed to care and were planning all along to sell her to government agents. Group after group that took her in when she was useful and betrayed her the moment she was not, or the moment the money got large enough. She was passed between pirates and criminals and organizations, always valued for what she could do, and never for who she was. Always one bad day away from being handed to the people who wanted her dead. She was called a demon. She was called a devil. She was called bad luck, a curse, a monster, the woman who brings ruin. A child grew into an adult hearing those words from nearly every mouth she encountered, and learning slowly the lesson the world was so determined to teach her, that she should not exist, that there was no place for her, that the safest thing she could ever do was to need no one and let no one close, because everyone in the end would betray her, because the whole world had agreed she was not allowed to live. By the time she was a grown woman, she had made a kind of terrible peace with it. She took work with a criminal organization called Baroque Works, run by a former warlord named Crocodile, and she did it not out of loyalty or belief, but because it was a place to be, a way to survive, a role. She became the cool, unreadable, faintly sinister woman called Miss All Sunday, who revealed nothing of herself to anyone, who kept every person at arm's length, because that distance was the only thing that had ever kept her alive. She had stopped by then, expecting anything else. She was not trying to live so much as she was continuing not to die, which is a different and much lonelier thing. Somewhere underneath all of it was still the 8-year-old who had been taught to laugh by a giant and told there was a sea full of people who would be glad she was born. But she had buried that girl so deep under so many years of betrayal that she no longer believed the promise. She was simply waiting, without admitting it even to herself, for the world to finally finish the job it had started on Ohara. It took nearly 20 years for the promise to come true, and when it did, it came the way the best things in this world tend to. Improbably, loudly, and through a boy too stubborn to accept that anyone was beyond saving. Robin eventually crossed paths with a young pirate crew led by a rubber-limbed boy named Luffy, and against every instinct she had spent 2 decades sharpening, they got past her guard. And at the very end of that arc of her life, cornered at last by the government that had hunted her since she was a child, offered the chance to simply give up and let them take her so that at least her new friends might be spared, Robin did something she had not done in 20 years. She stopped protecting everyone else by removing herself, and she admitted that she wanted to stay. When the crew made it unmistakable that they would go to war with the entire world rather than let her be taken, when their captain had the flag of the world government itself burned in front of her as a declaration that they did not care who they had to fight, something in her that had been holding its breath for 20 years finally broke open, and Nico Robin, who had spent her whole life being told she should never have been born, screamed through tears that she wanted to live, that she wanted to go back out to sea with them. It is one of the most cathartic moments in the entire story precisely because of everything behind it. Because you know exactly how many years of being told the opposite it took for her to be able to say that one simple thing out loud. That is the real history of Nico Robin. A stolen childhood, 2 decades of being hunted and betrayed, and told she was a curse and a hard-won, tearful, 20 years late permission to simply want to exist. It is a magnificent arc, and it is built entirely out of the worst thing that could possibly have happened to a child. Everything good about who Robin becomes, she becomes because of Ohara, and in spite of it, which brings us at last to the single afternoon we came here to change. Everything you have heard so far is real, and this telling does not undo a word of it lightly or pretend it did not happen. But sit for a moment with the exact mechanism of how the worst version came to be, because the hinge we are about to turn is not a fantasy. It is a real seam in the real events, a place where the true history itself came within minutes of going differently. Remember the sequence. The scholars of Ohara were, for most of that day, in terrible danger but not yet doomed. The government had come for them, agents were on the island, arrests, imprisonment, the seizure of the library. All of that was already certain and already a catastrophe. But the specific order that turned catastrophe into annihilation, that escalated a raid into a buster call, did not come at the start. It came at a precise moment, and it came because of two specific things happening close together. The first was the discovery of the hidden research, the secret chamber where the scholars kept their most advanced work, the hard proof that Ohara had not merely studied the forbidden history, but had genuinely begun to read it. And the second was Clover's phone call. The moment the head scholar, provoked and grieving and unable to stay silent, confirmed to the five elders directly how close his people had come, how much they actually knew, how near the world had drifted to having the void century spoken aloud again. It was those two things together, the evidence and the confirmation, that convinced the men at the summit of the world that nothing less than total erasure would do. Without that proof, the government had suspicion. It had captured Olvia's expedition. It knew Ohara was a den of illegal scholars. It had every reason to raid the place and cage its people and burn its books. But a buster call is a different order of thing, erasing an entire island from existence, drowning 1,000 civilians, wiping a place off every map. That is not a response you reach for on suspicion. It is what you do when you have looked directly at the proof that your deepest secret has very nearly been exposed, and decided that the only acceptable response is to make sure no trace remains. The proof is what pulled the trigger. Take away the proof, and the hand hesitates. So here is where this telling steps gently off the path of what happened and onto the path of what might have. It changes one thing, not a battle, not a rescue, not a hidden power. It changes a matter of minutes and a single choice made inside those minutes. Picture it. Saul, who in the real history saw the ships coming and understood immediately what they meant, gets his warning to the scholars just slightly sooner and slightly louder. Not a vague fear, but a former vice admiral standing in the tree of knowledge telling Professor Clover in plain and unarguable terms exactly what that many ships gathering offshore is the prelude to and exactly how little time they have. And Clover, who in the real history spent his last hour making a doomed, magnificent, defiant stand, makes in this telling a different last choice, a quieter one. A scholar's calculation rather than a scholar's defiance. He understands, with Saul's warning ringing in his ears, that the one thing that can turn this from a raid into an erasure is the government discovering how much Ohara truly knows. So he spends the little time he has not on defiance but on concealment. The scholars move fast. The deepest research, the actual readable translations, the proof of how far they had gotten, the smoking gun in the hidden chamber, is not left to be found. It is broken up, scattered, hidden far more thoroughly, some of it carried off the island entirely, some of it committed to memory and to nothing else, the physical evidence spirited away or destroyed by the scholar's own hands so that it cannot be destroyed by the government's. And when the agents finally tear the tree of knowledge apart looking for the containment failure they have been told to expect, they find a library, an enormous, ancient, irreplaceable library full of old books and old languages and the harmless dust of centuries, tended by a community of eccentric academics who studied history the way academics everywhere study history. They find scholars who clearly knew they were doing something forbidden, who clearly should be arrested and their work seized. What they do not find is proof that anyone on Ohara ever actually read a poneglyph, ever actually reconstructed the void century, ever actually came within reach of speaking the one forbidden truth aloud. And Clover, alive in this telling because he never provokes the phone call that gets him shot, gives them nothing. He is an old man surrounded by books, cooperating just enough, revealing nothing, a scholar playing the one role that might save his island, the harmless, over-curious academic who reached too far and got caught, rather than the dangerous man who very nearly succeeded. It is not a triumph. Nobody wins this afternoon. But it is enough, just barely enough, to change the size of the answer. Spandine reports up the chain that Ohara was a nest of illegal scholars, now contained, their library seized, their people to be arrested and watched. He does not report that the void century was nearly cracked because he has not found the proof that it was. And the 5 elders at the summit of the world, weighing whether to drown an entire island of civilians and draw all the scrutiny and horror that comes with it, decide this time that they do not need to. Contain it. Cage the scholars, seize the books, occupy the island and watch it forever. But do not, this once, call the buster call. And so the ships do not open fire. The tree of knowledge does not burn. And the single afternoon that, in the real history, ends with 1,000 people dead and an island erased and an 8-year-old drifting alone into 20 years of hell, ends here instead with something far quieter and far stranger and far more merciful. A raid, an occupation, an island under guard at nightfall, and a little girl who still has a mother. Let us be honest about what that night is actually like, though, because a mercy this large does not arrive feeling like mercy. It arrives feeling like disaster, just a survivable one. Ohara, on the evening the buster call does not come, is an occupied island. There are government ships in the harbor, and marines in the streets, and agents in the tree of knowledge. And the scholars who spent the day hiding their life's work are now, most of them, under arrest or about to be. The great library has been ransacked, books have been seized and burned and carted away. The forbidden research the scholars managed to hide is gone from their hands, even if it is not in the government's. Smuggled off, buried, memorized, scattered to keep it from being destroyed. Which means that for the scholars themselves, the thing they gave their freedom to protect is now beyond even their own reach. Whatever comes next for these people, it is not going to be gentle. Occupation is not kindness. Surveillance is not forgiveness. The world government has looked directly at Ohara and decided this time that it does not need to erase it. But it has not decided to leave it alone, and it never will. But nobody is dead. Hold on to that in the middle of all the loss because it is the entire difference. Professor Clover is alive, arrested probably, his life's work confiscated, an old man facing a government prison or worse, but breathing, unshot, still himself. The scholars who in the real history burned inside the tree are, in this telling, mostly alive, captured, scattered, their community shattered and watched, but alive. Saul is not a statue of ice on a beach. His warning worked, the thing he tried and failed to do in the real history he manages. Barely in this one. And whatever happens to a runaway giant on an occupied island, it is not that. And Olvia, Robin's mother, who raced home across the sea to die with her island, does not die with her island because her island does not die. She reaches home into the middle of the raid exactly as she did in the real history. But this time there is a home still standing to reach, and a daughter to reach it for, and no burning tree to vanish into. Picture the reunion then, not the impossible, torn-away sliver of the real history, a mother and daughter meeting for the first time only long enough to be separated forever by fire, but something slower and more painful and infinitely more precious. A mother and daughter meeting for the first time in a ruined library on an occupied island. Both of them alive, both of them going to stay alive, with all the time in the world ahead of them to figure out what that even means. It is not a happy reunion. There is nothing happy about the day. Olvia comes home to a caged island and an arrested community and a life's work confiscated, and she comes home carrying 20 years of guilt over having left. And Robin is 8 years old and has just watched the only world she knew fall under government guns. But Olvia comes home and she stays home and she is there, physically, actually there, for the daughter she abandoned to go chasing the truth across the sea. The abandonment that defined Robin's early life gets, in this telling, its one impossible correction. The mother comes back, and this time she does not leave again, in the only way a person cannot come back from. The 8-year-old at the center of it does not understand, that night, what she has been given, because from the inside it does not look like a gift. It looks like the worst day of her life, which it is. Her home is under occupation. Her people are in chains. The library she grew up inside has been gutted. Strangers with guns walk the streets she knew. And yet, when she is finally allowed to be still, when the longest and most terrible day of her childhood finally ends, Nico Robin is not alone in a boat drifting across open water toward 20 years of being hunted. She is on solid ground, on the island where she was born, with her mother's hand in hers. That is the whole of the mercy, not safety. There is no safety here, and there never will be again for anyone connected to Ohara. Just this: the little girl keeps her mother and her home and her people and her name and the small, serious life she had, damaged and shadowed and watched, but hers, and still standing. Everything that follows in this telling grows out of that one unburned night. And the strangest, most important thing about it is what it does not produce. It does not produce the Nico Robin the world came to know. The demon of Ohara, the woman with the impossible bounty, the survivor who learned across 20 lonely years that she should not exist and then, at the very end, tearfully learned that she was allowed to. That woman is forged entirely in the fire that here does not burn. And so this telling has to sit, honestly, with a strange and bittersweet truth that we will come back to before the end. That the mercy of Ohara surviving is also, quietly, the unmaking of the extraordinary person that the tragedy of Ohara created. The girl gets her childhood back. The world maybe loses the woman she would otherwise have become. We are not going to pretend those are the same kind of thing, or that the trade is simple. But that is for later. For now, just hold the image the whole night comes down to. An occupied island at nightfall, a ruined library, 1,000 frightened people who are nonetheless still alive, and a small girl who for the first time in this story gets to fall asleep in her own home, with her mother in the next room. So let us follow the little girl first, because she is the heart of all of it, and because the thing this telling gives back to her is the thing the real history took most cruelly, an ordinary life allowed to unfold at an ordinary pace. In the real history, Nico Robin's development as a person essentially stops on the day Ohara burns. Everything after is survival, a series of betrayals and flights and hidden identities, a childhood skipped entirely, a young woman who never gets to simply grow up because she is too busy staying alive. She becomes brilliant and guarded and unknowable and profoundly alone, and all of it is scar tissue formed over a wound that never gets the chance to heal because the world keeps reopening it. In this telling, none of that scar tissue ever forms because the wound is smaller and it is not left to fester in isolation. Robin grows up, slowly, ordinarily, on the island where she was born, surrounded by the strange, gentle people who raised her. She gets to do the one thing the real history never let her do. She gets to become an adult at the speed a person is supposed to become one, with the people who love her standing around her the whole way. It is not an easy childhood, and this telling would be lying to make it one. Ohara is occupied. There are Marines who never fully leave, and agents who come and go, and a permanent shadow over the island that everyone learns to live under. The scholars who were arrested face years of government punishment. The community is smaller and quieter and warier than it was. The great library is a censored, half-empty shell of what it was, with guards deciding what may and may not be read. Robin grows up in a place that has learned, the hard way, exactly how much the world hates what it loves, and she grows up knowing it. But she grows up, that is the thing. She is not hunted, she is not sold, she is not called a demon by every mouth she passes. She is a strange, serious girl in a wounded, scholarly community, and the other children may still find her a little odd, and the arms that bloom from walls may still unnerve them. But she is one of them, a daughter of the island, a known and placed and belonging person, rather than a curse drifting alone across the sea. And she has her mother. This is the piece worth lingering on, because it is the one the real history denies most completely, and this telling restores most fully. Olvia comes home and stays, and the mother and daughter who met for the first time on the worst day of their lives get, instead of a single torn-away moment, years. Years of ordinary things. Years of a woman who left her daughter to chase the truth across the sea, getting to spend the rest of her life making up for it in the small daily currency that is the only real currency there is. Meals, conversations, corrections, arguments, the teaching of an ancient script by a mother to a daughter who was already impossibly better at it than she was. Olvia carries guilt. You do not abandon a young child and race back years later into a war zone without carrying guilt for the rest of your life. But she gets to spend that guilt on presents. She gets to actually be Robin's mother, day after ordinary day, instead of being a face the little girl could not remember, and a promise that kept not being kept. Picture the two of them in the ruined library in the quiet years after. The tree of knowledge is diminished, watched, censored, but it still stands, and there are still books in it, and there are still two Nico women bent over a table with a lamp between them, working through some old text the guards have decided is harmless enough to allow. Olvia teaching, Robin learning, or as often as not the other way around. The lonely child who in the real history had to be taught to laugh by a passing giant because no one else had managed it. That child in this telling learns to laugh the ordinary way, slowly, over years, from a mother who is simply there, in the small, unremarkable moments that a life is actually made of. It is not dramatic. It is not the stuff of legend. It is exactly the thing the real Robin was robbed of and spent 20 years unable to even imagine she was allowed to want, a childhood with a parent in it, in a home that did not disappear. There is a particular kind of grief, if you have ever carried it, in watching a person become extraordinary because of something terrible that happened to them, and wondering who they would have been if it hadn't. The real Nico Robin is one of the most remarkable people in her entire world precisely because of what Ohara did to her. Her strength, her guardedness, her hard-won capacity to finally choose life, all of it forged in that specific fire. This telling gives us the other Robin, the one the fire never made. Quieter, probably, less scarred, certainly, less alone, maybe less extraordinary in the specific way that only suffering makes people extraordinary, but also simply ordinarily happy in a way the real Robin did not get to be until she was nearly 30, if she ever fully got to be at all. We are not going to pretend one of those women is better than the other. We are only going to sit for a while with the one the real story never let us meet. Nico Robin, growing up loved, on the island that didn't burn. Now let us turn to the man who, in the real history, dies with a sentence half finished, Professor Clover. Because what happens to him in this telling is quieter than survival usually is in stories, and worth sitting with precisely because it is not triumphant. Clover lives in this telling because he never makes the phone call that gets him killed. But living for Clover does not mean walking free. An old scholar who led an entire island in the most forbidden research in the world does not simply go back to his books once the government has found him out. He is arrested. His life's work is confiscated. He very likely spends the rest of his years in a government prison or under a confinement so total it amounts to the same thing, watched and questioned, and never again permitted anywhere near a poneglyph or a student or a page of the history he gave his life to. The mercy this telling extends to him is not freedom. It is breath. He gets to keep being alive and being himself, and knowing that his island and his people were not erased. That the thing he spent his last real day of freedom protecting, the survival of Ohara and its knowledge, actually held. And there is a particular dignity in the trade Clover makes in this version, one that fits everything we know about who he was. In the real history, given the choice between defiance and silence, Clover chose defiance, chose to spend his last breath trying to speak the truth aloud to the most powerful people in the world, knowing they would kill him for it. Because a scholar's deepest instinct is that the truth deserves to be said even if saying it costs everything. It is a magnificent choice, and it is also, in the coldest terms, the choice that seals the island's fate, because it is the confirmation the government needs. In this telling, Clover makes the harder and less glorious choice. He swallows the truth. He stays silent. He plays the harmless old fool, reveals nothing, lets the government believe Ohara reached less far than it did. And he does it knowing that this quieter, less heroic path is the one that actually saves his people. It is a real sacrifice, just an inward one. He gives up the grand, defiant gesture, the chance to finally say the thing aloud, in exchange for the survival of everyone he is responsible for. A lesser man would have needed the gesture. Clover, in this telling, is scholar enough and shepherd enough to understand that sometimes the truest way to protect knowledge is to make its keepers look like they never had it. The knowledge itself survives too, in a form worth thinking about carefully. In the real history, the burning of the tree of knowledge is a catastrophe for the entire world, not just for Ohara, an enormous store of recovered truth, the closest anyone had come in 800 years to reconstructing the void century, all of it turned to ash in an afternoon. In this telling, that store does not burn, but it does not stay safe and accessible either. It goes underground in every sense. The scholars, in the frantic hours of hiding their work, do the only thing they can. They get the most dangerous knowledge out of the places it can be found. Some of it is smuggled off the island, some of it is buried, and a great deal of it, the most forbidden pieces, the actual readings of the actual stones, is committed to the one hiding place the government can never raid, which is living human memory. The scholars of Ohara carry the truth out of that day inside their own heads, unwritten, unprovable, undestroyable, so long as they draw breath. Which means the knowledge survives exactly as long as the people do, and no longer, and that the world government now has, without fully realizing it, a small population of prisoners, and watched civilians who quietly carry inside them the very thing the whole Buster Call system exists to erase. That is a very different way for the truth to survive than the way it survives in the real history. In the real history, the truth survives as a wound, carried by a single traumatized woman across 20 years of flight, a burden more than an inheritance, the thing that makes Nico Robin hunted. In this telling, the truth survives as a secret held in common, carried not by one broken person, but by a whole community of living minds, passed quietly from the old scholars to the younger ones, from a mother to a daughter over a lamplit table, kept alive the way knowledge was kept alive for most of human history before there were libraries at all, in memory, in teaching, in the patient refusal of a group of people to let a thing be forgotten. The government drowned the library in the real history and nearly drowned the knowledge with it. In this telling, the library is caged, but the knowledge is loose, not published, not spoken aloud, not safe, but alive, distributed across too many minds to ever fully stamp out. And the men at the summit of the world do not even know it. They think they contained Ohara. They think the harmless old scholars reached too far and got caught and were dealt with. They do not know that the very restraint they showed, choosing to cage rather than erase, is the reason their deepest secret now lives on in 100 quiet heads instead of dying in one afternoon's fire. There is a giant to account for, too, because Saul is one of the warmest presences in the whole story and one of the hardest losses, and this telling owes him more than a passing mention. In the real history, Jaguar D. Saul is frozen solid on a beach. Having succeeded at the one thing he set out to do, getting Robin off the island, and been torn out of her life in the very same moment, a giant turned to ice, gone from her world for what would be more than 20 years, mourned by the one child who loved him as lost. In this telling, his warning is the very thing that changes the day, which means his story bends away from that beach entirely. But it is worth being careful here, because Saul's situation is genuinely complicated even in the gentler version, and pretending otherwise would cheapen him. Saul is a deserter. He is a former Marine vice admiral who walked away from the government, and now he is a very large, very conspicuous fugitive on an island that the government has just occupied. His survival is not clean or safe. The most this telling can honestly give him is a chance, and an exit. So picture it this way. In the frantic hours of the raid, Saul does what he does in the real history. He warns, he protects, he stands between the little girl he loves and the force coming for her. But because the escalation to a Buster Call never comes, because the day stays a raid instead of becoming an erasure, the specific confrontation that freezes him and tears him out of Robin's life never quite arrives. There is no burning island to flee, no fleet bombardment to enrage him into sinking ships, no moment where his old friend Kuzan is forced to choose between duty and mercy on a beach with the world ending around them. Instead, there is chaos and an occupation, and in the confusion of it, a giant does the thing giants are best at when they are not fighting, which is disappearing over a horizon. Saul gets off Ohara. Where a runaway giant goes from there, this telling does not need to chart precisely. The giants have a homeland of their own, the far island of Elbaf. and it is easy enough to imagine an old deserter making the long, quiet journey toward the one place in the world built to the scale of his own kind. What matters is that he does not become a statue of ice. He carries his strange, honking laugh out of that day and off toward whatever comes next, alive. And here is the piece that makes his survival more than just a spared life. It is a spared friendship too. Because in the real history, the last thing Saul and Kuzan ever do to each other is the worst thing. One freezes the other's solid, duty-killing friendship on a beach. That is how their long bond ends in the real story, with an admiral turning his friend to ice because the alternative was disobeying an order to erase an island. In this telling, that final confrontation never happens because the beach never happens, because the buster call never happens. Kuzan is still there, still a Marine officer, still bound by the occupation, still the cold, half-kind man he is. But he is not put in the impossible position of having to kill his friend. Whatever happens between Saul and Kuzan in this telling, it is not that. The friendship does not end with one of them freezing the other. It just continues to exist, unresolved, two old soldiers on opposite sides of a line, one of them a fugitive giant heading home, and the other an officer who quietly let him go, or at least did not try very hard to stop him. It is a smaller mercy than Robin keeping her mother, but it is a real one, and it belongs to a character who deserved better than the beach the real history gave him. Kuzan himself is worth a thought, because he is the thin thread the whole real history hangs on. And in this telling, that thread never has to bear the weight it bears in the real one. In the real history, Kuzan's single act of half-mercy, sparing the child, giving her a boat, warning her coldly that he would come for her if she ever became a criminal, is the only reason there is a Nico Robin at all. It is a cold, compromised, guilt-ridden kindness, extended by a man who could not quite bring himself to murder a little girl even though his orders and his justice both pointed that way. In this telling, he never has to make that terrible half-choice because there is no burning island and no orphan survivor drifting away for him to spare. Robin is not a lone child in a boat that Kuzan lets escape. She is a daughter of an occupied island, alive because the island is alive. No cold mercy required. Which means Kuzan gets to keep, in this telling, something he loses in the real one. He does not have to be the man who froze his friend and spared a child on the same terrible afternoon. He gets to remain simply a Marine doing an ugly job on an occupied island, no better than that, but also not marked forever by the specific two griefs the real history hands him. It is not redemption. Kuzan is not a good man in either telling exactly. But this telling spares him the beach too, and there is a quiet mercy even in that. Let us widen the frame now, gently, and think about what an occupied, surviving Ohara means for the world government itself. Because the most interesting consequence of this whole divergence is not what it gives to Robin, but what it quietly costs the most powerful people in the world without their ever knowing it. The government's entire method for keeping the Void Century buried rests on erasure. When a threat to the secret appears, the answer is total. Destroy the place. Kill the people. Remove even the memory that anything was ever there. The Buster Call exists precisely so that dangerous knowledge can be made to have never existed. It is a brutally effective system, and its effectiveness depends on completeness. On nothing surviving, no witnesses, no records, no minds left carrying the forbidden thing. The horror of Ohara in the real history is also, from the government's cold perspective, a success. An island of people who nearly cracked the secret, erased so thoroughly that the only survivor became a hunted fugitive whose word no one would ever believe, and who would spend her life running rather than teaching. In this telling, the government trades that terrible completeness for something that looks, on the surface, like restraint, and is actually a slow-acting failure. By choosing to cage Ohara rather than erase it, because it never got the proof that erasure was necessary. The government leaves alive exactly the thing the Buster Call exists to destroy, living minds that carry the forbidden knowledge. It does not know this. That is the crucial part. The men at the summit of the world believe they contain the Ohara problem. They believe the scholars reached too far and got caught before they truly succeeded. They believe, because they never saw the hidden research and never heard Clover confirm how close his people had come, that the secret held. And so they do not hunt the survivors, because in their understanding there is nothing to hunt. No dangerous truth got out, just some over-curious academics who have now been dealt with. The 8-year-old who in the real history became the most wanted person on the seas is, in this telling, invisible to them, because they have no reason to think she is dangerous. They do not know she can read the stones. They do not know her mother taught her the truth over a lamplit table. They do not know that the very restraint they showed is the reason their deepest secret is now distributed across a whole community of living memory instead of drowned in one afternoon's fire. Sit with the irony of that, because it is the quiet engine of this whole telling. The government's mercy is its mistake. Every time in the real history that it chose total erasure, it won. The secret stayed buried. The threat was removed. The one time, in this imagined version, that it chooses something less than total erasure, it loses, slowly, invisibly, without even knowing a loss has occurred. Because knowledge, once it is loose in enough living minds, cannot be unknown by decree. You can burn a library, you cannot burn what 100 people remember. The government's power over the truth was always a power of destruction, and the moment it declines to destroy, even for good, cautious, self-interested reasons, the truth begins, quietly, to survive it. This does not mean the truth gets out. That is worth being careful about, because it would be easy to imagine this telling ending with the void century exposed, the government toppled, the whole secret spilled into the open. It does not, and it should not, because that is not what one saved island can plausibly do. The scholars of Ohara are prisoners and watch civilians on an occupied rock, not revolutionaries with an army. They cannot broadcast the truth, they can only keep it. The knowledge they carry does not overthrow anything. It simply persists, passed quietly from the old to the young, held in common, waiting. Waiting for what? This telling does not presume to say. Maybe for nothing. Maybe for a day, decades off, when the world changes enough that a truth held in 100 quiet heads can finally be spoken aloud safely. The point is not that Ohara's survival changes the world. The point is that it keeps a door from being permanently sealed. That in a world where the most powerful people alive have spent 800 years making sure a certain truth can never survive, one small island, by not quite dying, becomes a place where it does. Not loudly, not triumphantly, just stubbornly, patiently, the way scholars keep things, alive and waiting and refusing to be forgotten. There is a harder thread to follow now, and this telling would not be honest if it skipped it. The cost. Because saving Ohara does not only give things back, it also, quietly, takes something away. And the something it takes is one of the most beloved journeys in the entire story. In the real history, Nico Robin's survival of Ohara sets her, eventually, on a path that leads her to a specific crew of pirates, and to a boy named Luffy, and to a place at a table with people who become, over years, the family she was told her whole life she would never have. Everything about that, her joining the crew, her nearly leaving it to protect them, the moment at the very end where she finally screams that she wants to live, and they burn a nation's flag rather than lose her. All of it grows directly out of the tragedy of Ohara. The hunted woman needs the crew because she has spent 20 years being betrayed and cannot believe anyone would choose her. The crew's choosing of her matters so enormously precisely because of how completely the world had unchosen her first. Robin becomes a straw hat because Ohara broke her, and the mending is the whole point. In this telling, that Robin does not exist, and so that journey may never happen. Sit with that, honestly, because it is the real price of the mercy. A Robin who grows up loved on a surviving island with her mother and her people and her name has no reason to become a lonely fugitive, no reason to drift into a criminal organization to survive, no reason to be at the specific crossroads where the real Robin's path collides with a young pirate cruise. She might live her whole life on Ohara, a scholar among scholars, and never once meet the boy in the straw hat. The crew that in the real history gains one of its most beloved members might sail right past a West Blue island they have no reason to visit, never knowing that the woman who should have been theirs is inside it, bent over a lamplit table, happy, and entirely unaware that anyone was ever supposed to come for her. The family is not formed because the wound that made it necessary never opened. And that is a genuine loss, not to Robin, who is better off, but to the story and to the people who in the real history become her family, and who in this telling simply never get to know what they are missing. This is the honest shape of a mercy like this one, and it is worth naming plainly because it is easy to imagine that undoing a tragedy is pure gain, and it almost never is. The things that break us also make us into the specific people we become, and the people who love us love the specific person the breaking made. You cannot reach back and unbreak someone without also unmaking the person they turned into, and everyone that person went on to touch, and every bond that formed in the shape of the wound. This telling gives an 8-year-old her mother back. It also, in doing so, quietly erases the extraordinary woman that 8-year-old would otherwise have grown into, and the crew that woman would have joined, and the tearful, hard-won moment where she finally learned she was allowed to live. Both of those are real. The mercy is real, and the cost is real. And they are the same act seen from two sides, which leaves us with a strange and quiet question that this whole telling has been circling and that it does not try to answer because it cannot be answered. Which Robin is the one you would wish for her? The real one who suffers unspeakably for 20 years and emerges extraordinary, scarred, and finally, hard-wonly, loved? Who gets the family precisely because she lost everything first, or the imagined one, who suffers a single terrible day and then simply grows up, quietly, ordinarily happy, on the island that didn't burn, never extraordinary in the way only suffering makes people extraordinary and never needing to be? There is no right answer. If you ask the real Robin at the end of her long journey, surrounded at last by the family she nearly died without, whether she would trade all of it, the family, the belonging, the person she became, to have kept her mother and her home and her ordinary childhood, you genuinely do not know what she would say, and neither does she, and that uncertainty is the whole ache of the thing. Some wounds we would never wish on anyone and would also never trade, because of who they made us and who they gave us. This telling does not resolve that. It just holds both Robins up in the quiet, side by side, and lets you sit with them for a while, and feel how strange it is that a single unburned afternoon could give a little girl everything and cost her at the very same time the extraordinary life the burning would have made. Let us stay with the mother a little longer, because Nico Olvia is a figure the real history barely lets us know. She appears mostly to die, and this telling gives her the one thing the real story never does, which is time. And time is where a person actually becomes real. In the real history, we meet Olvia essentially at her end. We learn she was a brilliant archaeologist, that she left her young daughter to join the research expedition, that she was captured, that she escaped and raced home, that she reached Robin for one impossible moment and then chose to die with her island. She is defined almost entirely by a departure and a death, by leaving her daughter and by dying for her, the two great sacrificial bookends of a life we otherwise know almost nothing about. It is a noble portrait and a thin one, and it is thin because the fire does not leave room for anything else. A woman who dies on the day we meet her can only ever be her sacrifice. This telling gives her the years the fire denied her, and the years are where the guilt lives and the making up for it, and the ordinary difficult work of being a parent to a child you once left. Because Olvia's choice to leave Robin was not a simple one, and living with it would not be simple either. She went to sea to help recover the truth of the void century, a cause she believed in enough to leave her own small child for. That is a real thing to have done, and a real thing to carry. In the real history, she carries it for only as long as it takes to die. Her guilt is resolved by sacrifice, paid off in a single afternoon. In this telling, she has to carry it the hard way, the long way, the way most parents carry their failures. By living alongside the person they failed, day after day, trying to be better, never fully sure they have made up for it. Watching the child grow up and wondering privately whether the leaving left a mark that all the staying in the world can't quite smooth away. And it probably does leave a mark. Robin, in this telling, is a happier child than the real Robin by an immeasurable distance. But she is still a child whose mother once left her for years to chase a truth across the sea, and that is not nothing, and it would not vanish just because the mother came back. There would be a wariness in her maybe, a small held-back part, a child's buried question of whether the person who left once might leave again. And Olvia would spend years answering that question the only way it can be answered, which is by not leaving, by being there for every ordinary, unremarkable day until the wariness slowly, finally, wears down into trust. That is a richer and more human relationship than the real history's single tragic reunion could ever be. It is a mother and a daughter doing the actual work of becoming a mother and a daughter, late, imperfectly, under occupation, with a shadow over the whole island. But doing it, which is more than the fire ever let them do. There is a particular scene worth imagining, invented like everything since the Divergence, but the kind of small, quiet thing that a whole reimagined life comes down to. Years after the raid, the two of them at that lamp-lit table in the diminished library working through some old harmless text, and Robin, a teenager now, or a young woman, asks her mother something she has never quite asked before. Why she left, not accusingly, not as a wound anymore, just as a daughter old enough now to actually want the answer. And Olvia, who has been waiting years for the question and dreading it and rehearsing it, tries to explain the unexplainable, that she loved her, that she loved the truth, that she thought she could serve the second without abandoning the first and was wrong, that she has spent every day since coming home trying to be the mother she wasn't at the start. It is not a clean answer. There is no clean answer to why a parent left, but it is an answer given face to face over years of earned trust by a woman who is alive to give it. And that, too, is a thing the real history burns before it can happen. The real Robin never gets to ask her mother why. She only gets the leaving and the dying, the two sacrifices, and a lifetime of filling in the silence between them alone. This telling gives her the conversation. It is a small thing. It is also, maybe, everything. We should talk about the great mystery at the center of all of this, the Void Century itself. Because a story about the island that almost read it invites the question of what surviving actually means for the secret. And this telling has to be very disciplined about what it does and does not claim. Here's the discipline, stated plainly once. This telling does not tell you what the Void Century contained. It cannot, and it should not, because the real story has never told anyone. And an imagined alternate history has no business pretending to answer a question the actual work has spent decades deliberately withholding. Professor Clover, in the real history, is shot before he can speak the name of the kingdom he had discovered. In this telling, Clover is not shot, but he still does not speak the name because he swallows the truth to save his island, and because even if he whispered it to his fellow scholars in the dark, it would not travel from their heads to yours. The knowledge surviving inside the minds of Ohara's scholars does not mean the knowledge surviving inside yours. The door stays closed. What this telling imagines is not the answer to the mystery. It is the survival of the people who hold a piece of it, which is a different and much smaller and much more human thing. But we can talk about the shape of what they carry without spilling it, because the shape is enough to feel the weight. What the scholars of Ohara nearly reconstructed and what in this telling survives in their memory is a version of the past that the entire present-day world is built on not knowing. Somewhere in those 100 erased years there was a kingdom. Clover found it, followed the evidence to it, was about to name it when the bullet came. A kingdom that lost a war 800 years ago, so completely that winners were able to erase its very name from history and build their own rule on the blank space where it used to be. The scholars of Ohara had gotten close enough to that kingdom's memory that the government decided an entire island had to die. And in this telling, that memory does not die. It lives on, unspoken, in the heads of the people who nearly recovered it. A defeated kingdom's true story, kept alive by a handful of librarians on an occupied rock, 8 centuries after the world agreed it had never existed. There is something almost unbearably poignant in that, if you sit with it. The whole architecture of the world government rests on a forgetting, on the certainty that the losers of that ancient war are gone so completely that not even their name survives. And the entire point of the Poneglyphs, the reason someone carved the truth into indestructible stone at the end of that century, was a refusal of exactly that forgetting. A bet placed 800 years ago by people who knew they were losing, that if they could just make the truth survive in a form that could not be destroyed, then someday, somehow, someone would read it and the forgetting would not be permanent, and their side of the story would finally be heard. The scholars of Ohara are the people who took that bet up. They are the ones who, 8 centuries later, actually did the thing the poneglyph carvers hoped someone eventually would. They learned the language, they read the stones, they recovered the memory. In the real history, the government catches them in the act and burns them for it. and the bet very nearly fails, saved only by a single traumatized survivor carrying the fragments alone. In this telling, the bet holds better. The people who read the truth do not all die. The memory does not rest on one hunted woman. It lives distributed across a community, taught quietly from the old to the young, waiting for its day the way it has already waited 800 years. That is what Ohara surviving actually preserves. Not the answer, but the continuity. The unbroken chain of people willing to remember a thing the powerful want forgotten. In the real history, that chain nearly snaps to a single thread. In this telling, it holds frayed but whole. And there is a lesson buried in that which has nothing to do with pirates or governments or ancient wars, and everything to do with why any of us keep old and inconvenient truths alive at all. That a thing is not truly gone as long as someone still remembers it, and that the simplest, oldest, most stubborn form of resistance against a power that rules by forgetting is a group of quiet people who refuse to forget. The government can burn the library. It cannot this time burn the librarians. And so the truth waits, alive in the one place no fleet can reach, inside the people who decided it was worth remembering. Let us come back to the little girl, because there is a version of her that this telling makes possible that is worth picturing in full. Not the scholar she becomes, not the survivor she is spared from becoming, but simply the child and the specific ordinary joys the real history steals from her. The real Nico Robin, remember, was already lonely before the fire. The other children feared her. The arms that bloomed from walls unnerved them. She was too serious and too gifted and too strange, and she spent her days at the edge of things with a book, waiting for someone to want her company. That loneliness is part of what makes her later isolation so total. She did not fall from a warm childhood into a cold exile. She fell from a lonely childhood into a colder one. But loneliness in a child is not fate. It is a stage, a thing most lonely children eventually grow out of when the world gives them the time and the safety to. The tragedy of the real Robin is not just that she was lonely as a small girl. It is that the fire froze her there, at 8, in the loneliness, and never let her grow past it, because from that day on she was too busy surviving to make a single friend she could keep. This telling gives her the time to grow past it. A child who keeps her home and her people and her mother gets to do the thing lonely children do when they are allowed to. She gets older and the other children get older, and the strangeness that frightened them at 6 or 8 stops frightening them at 12 or 14. And somewhere in there, the odd, serious girl with the blooming arms becomes simply a person the other young people of the island know and are used to, and eventually, some of them like. Maybe the very power that made the children flee her becomes, as they all grow up, the thing that makes her interesting, even a little admired. There is an age at which a girl who can make a hand sprout from a wall to grab the last piece of fruit off a high shelf stops being terrifying and starts being the most useful friend at a party. The loneliness that in real history hardens into a permanent, load-bearing wall around her heart gets, in this telling, the ordinary chance to just thaw slowly, the way most childhood loneliness does, given enough years and enough safety and enough people who stay. And she gets a mother to be lonely to, which is its own quiet mercy. There is a specific loneliness a child feels that is only cured by a parent, not by friends, not by teachers, but by the particular person who is supposed to be on your side no matter what. The real Robin never has that. Her mother is a face she can't remember, and then a woman who dies the day she meets her. The imagined Robin has it, imperfectly, guiltily, but really. A mother to come home to on the bad days, a mother to be misunderstood by, and to argue with and to be held by, a mother whose simple continued presence tells a lonely child the one thing loneliness most needs to hear, which is that she is not, in the end, alone. You do not have to fix a lonely child's whole life to change it completely. You only have to make sure that when she goes to bed at night, there is someone in the house who is glad she is there. The real Robin does not have that for 20 years. The imagined one has it from the night the island doesn't burn. Picture her then, at some ordinary age, the real Robin never got to be an ordinary version of 16, say, on the island, on a day with nothing terrible in it. The occupation is still there in the background, the way a chronic ache is always there. The shadow over Ohara never fully lifts, but it is an ordinary day. She has spent the morning with some old text, and the afternoon with people her own age who have long since stopped being afraid of her, and the evening will end with her mother. She is a scholar and a daughter and a friend and a citizen of a wounded but living island, and not one single person on the entire sea is hunting her, because not one single person on the entire sea has any reason to believe she is anything other than exactly what she appears to be. A bright young woman from a small West Blue island that the government keeps an eye on. That girl, that ordinary, safe, placed, loved girl, is the one the fire erases in the real history before she can ever exist. This whole telling is, in a sense, just the act of imagining her into being for a couple of quiet hours. The Nico Robin who got to grow up and be lonely in the ordinary way, and grow out of it in the ordinary way, and fall asleep every night of her childhood in a house where someone was glad she was born. There is one more piece of the little girl worth turning over, because it is the thing that set her apart most sharply as a child. And this telling does something quietly lovely to it over the years: her power. Robin had eaten a devil fruit, the hana no mi, the flower fruit, which let her make copies of her own body parts bloom into being from any surface she chose. An arm sprouting from a wall, a hand rising from the floor, eyes and ears opening on a distant tree so she could see and hear things far away. To an adult, it is an extraordinary and versatile gift. To the other small children of Ohara, it was the stuff of nightmares, a girl who could make disembodied limbs appear out of nothing, and it was one of the main reasons they kept their distance from her. The very thing that made Robin remarkable made her frightening, and a lonely child learns quickly to feel that a gift which drives everyone away is not a gift at all, but a curse. One more piece of evidence that she is strange and wrong and better kept apart. In the real history, that feeling never gets the chance to change because the fire freezes it in place. Robin goes into her 20 years of exile with a power the world has taught her to see as one more reason to be feared, and out in that hunted life it becomes mostly exactly that. A weapon, a tool for survival, a thing that marks her as the dangerous demon woman the bounty posters promise. The power that could have been a wonder becomes, in a life spent being hunted, just another part of why she is hunted. She grows into a master of it, certainly, but she masters it the way you master anything you need to survive, out of necessity rather than delight. And the small girl's ache of having a gift that made everyone afraid never really heals, because the world never gives her a reason to feel any differently about it. This telling gives her the reason. A power that frightens 6-year-olds does not frighten 16-year-olds, not once they have grown up alongside it and gotten used to it and watched it be useful and gentle and even funny for a decade. Given the year, the safety, the same ability that made the other children flee becomes simply a thing Robin can do. An ordinary part of an ordinary person, no more frightening by the time everyone is grown than any other talent. And in a life with room in it for lightness, a power like that has an enormous capacity for lightness. A hand that blooms from a high shelf to fetch a book she can't reach. An extra pair of arms to carry more than 2 arms could. Eyes she can open across the island to check whether her mother is on her way home yet. A scholar with the hana no mi is not a nightmare. She is the most useful person in any library, the one who can hold 6 open books at once and turn all their pages, the friend who can reach the thing on the top shelf without a ladder. The power that isolated the child becomes, in the woman, just a quietly wonderful part of who she is, and once in a while, on a good day, even a small joy. That is such a small thing, and it stands for such a large one. The real tragedy of Robin's power in the real history is not the power itself. It is that she was never given the time and the safety to make peace with it, to grow from the frightened child with the cursed-seeming gift into the grown woman for whom it is simply, unremarkably hers. This telling gives her that time. It lets the curse become a gift the ordinary way. Not through some dramatic revelation, but through years and safety and people who stay long enough to stop being afraid. And there is a truth in that worth holding on to as you drift, that most of the things about us that feel like curses when we are young and alone turn out, given enough time and enough love and enough people who don't flee, to be just parts of us, neither gifts nor curses in the end, only ours, and gentler than they seemed in the dark. The little girl whose power made the other children run gets, in this telling, to grow all the way up into a woman reaching a blooming hand toward a high shelf in a quiet library, thinking nothing of it at all. That is what safety does, given enough time. It turns the thing you were afraid of in yourself into just another part of an ordinary evening. There is a phrase that hangs over the real Nico Robin's entire story, the words that mark the turning point of her whole life. And it is worth holding this telling up against them, because the contrast says everything about what an unburned island actually changes. The words are, "I want to live." In the real history, those are the words Robin finally screams, through tears, at the very end of 2 decades of being told the opposite. The moment she stops trying to disappear for everyone else's sake, and admits out loud for the first time since she was 8 years old that she wants to exist. It is one of the most powerful moments in her entire story, and it is powerful precisely because of the 20 years of silence behind it. She can only say, "I want to live" at 28 because she spent the 20 years before it being taught by nearly every person she met that she shouldn't. The scream is cathartic because it is a dam breaking. It is the sound of a person finally being allowed to want the one thing every living creature is supposed to be able to want without permission. And the reason it lands so hard is that we know exactly how long and how cruelly that permission was withheld. In this telling, Nico Robin never has to scream those words because she is never made to doubt them. And that is a strange thing to hold because on the surface it sounds like a loss. We lose the great cathartic moment, the flag burning, the tears, the crew going to war for her. And we do lose it, but consider what the loss is made of. The reason the real Robin has to scream, "I want to live" at 28 is that the world spent 20 years telling her she had no right to. The reason the imagined Robin never screams it is that no one ever tells her she has no right to in the first place. The catharsis is missing because the wound is missing. She does not get the magnificent moment of finally claiming her right to exist, because her right to exist was never taken away. There is no dam to break because the river was never dammed, which is the quiet, almost unbearable truth this whole telling keeps circling back to. The most beautiful moment in the real Robin's life is beautiful because of the ugliest thing that ever happened to her, and you cannot have the one without the other. Remove the fire, and you remove the 20 years of being told she should not exist, and you remove, therefore, the shattering relief of finally being told she should. The imagined Robin lives a life that never requires that relief because it never inflicts the despair that makes the relief necessary. She does not get the mountaintop because she is never thrown into the pit, and a person who has never been in the pit cannot know the specific joy of climbing out of it. But they also never have to live in it, and if you could choose for a child you loved between a life with the pit and the mountaintop both, and a life with neither, it is not at all obvious which you would wish for her. Most of us, I think, faced with an actual 8-year-old, would choose to spare her the pit and let the mountaintop go unclimbed and count it a good trade. But we would know, choosing it, that we were trading away something magnificent along with something terrible, and that the person she would have become on the far side of the suffering, extraordinary, scarred, hard-wonly alive, was a person the world would now never get to meet. This telling makes that trade. It spares the child the pit. It lets the mountaintop go unclimbed. And it asks you to sit in the quiet with the strange grief of a happy ending. The melancholy that comes from getting a person everything you would have wanted for them, and knowing that in giving it to them, you have quietly erased the magnificent, broken, beloved version of them that only the suffering could have made. The real Robin earns the words, "I want to live" across 20 years of hell. The imagined Robin never needs to say them because she never spends a day of her life believing she shouldn't. One of those is a triumph, the other is a mercy. This telling chose the mercy. It does not pretend the triumph costs nothing. Follow the ripple outward one more step to the crew that never gains her because there is a specific and fascinating consequence hiding there that is worth drawing out. In the real history, Nico Robin is not just a beloved member of the pirate crew she joins. She is, in a very concrete sense, essential to their entire goal. The crew's dream, the thing their captain is sailing toward, requires reaching a specific final island at the end of the world, and reaching that island requires reading the Poneglyphs. The The same indestructible stones the government kills people for reading. There are only a handful of people alive who can read that ancient script, and Robin is one of them. When she joins the crew, she does not just bring her wit and her calm and her hard-won loyalty. She brings the single rarest and most necessary skill for the journey they are on. Without a Poneglyph reader, the crew's ultimate goal is, quite literally, unreachable. Robin is not a passenger on the voyage to the end of the world. She is, in a real sense, the key to the door at the end of it. Which means that in this telling, where Robin grows up safe on Ohara and never becomes a fugitive and never crosses the crew's path, the crew is missing not just a friend, but a function. The door at the end of the world still needs a reader, and the person who was supposed to be that reader is sitting in a library in the West Blue, happy and unhunted and entirely unaware that anywhere out on the Grand Line, a young pirate is chasing a dream he cannot actually complete without her. This telling does not need to resolve how that crew manages. Maybe they find another reader, maybe their journey stalls, maybe the whole race to the end of the world unfolds differently without the one person who could translate its final clues. The point is not to chart it. The point is to notice the shape of the loss. That saving one little girl on one small island reaches all the way to the end of the world and quietly removes the key from the lock. A mercy in the West Blue becomes an absence on the Grand Line. That is how connected everything is in a story like this. Pull one thread 20 years in the past, and a door at the edge of the map may never open. There is something worth sitting with in that, beyond the mechanics of it. It is the way the real history quietly arranged for the worst thing that ever happened to Robin to become, decades later, the thing that made her indispensable to the people she loved. The fire that orphaned her also made her the sole young survivor carrying a skill the whole world had tried to erase. And that skill is precisely what earns her a place at the center of a crew's impossible dream. Her tragedy becomes her value. The thing that made her hunted becomes the thing that makes her needed. There is a terrible poetry in that, the kind the real story is full of. That a person can be broken by the world in a way that later becomes the exact reason a family cannot do without them. This telling severs that poetry. The imagined Robin never becomes indispensable to anyone's dream, because she never suffers the loss that would have made her so. She is just a scholar on an island, useful to her own community, unknown to the wider world. It is a smaller life. It is also a life where her worth to others was never purchased with her own suffering, where she gets to matter to the people around her for ordinary reasons, because she is kind and clever and present, rather than because a genocide left her holding the one key a crew of dreamers needed. Which of those is the better way to be needed is, once again, not a question this telling answers. It only notices that they are different and that the mercy quietly trades one for the other. And maybe this is the gentlest way to leave it. Maybe somewhere out on the Grand Line, in this telling, a young crew chasing the end of the world simply has to find their reader some other way, or wait longer, or grow into the answer differently. Stories find their shapes. The door at the end of the world has waited 800 years. It can wait a little longer for a different key. What matters for tonight is not whether that crew reaches their island. What matters is that the little girl who was supposed to be their key never had to be broken into the shape of one, never had to lose everything in order to become necessary, and instead just got to grow up on her island being needed by the people right in front of her, for nothing more dramatic than being herself. There is one promise in all of this that deserves to be picked up and turned over gently, because it is the thread that ties the lonely child to the woman she becomes. And this telling does something quietly strange to it. It is the promise Saul made. Remember what the giant told the lonely little girl. In the short, warm time they had before the end, he told her that no matter how bad things got, somewhere out there was a whole sea full of people who would be glad she was born. And that one day she would find them and sail with them and finally laugh with them for real. In the real history, that promise is a lifeline thrown across 20 years. It is the thing Robin holds on to, sometimes barely, sometimes not at all, through 2 decades of betrayal and flight. The buried, half-disbelieved hope that Saul might have been right, that the sea full of people who would be glad she was born might actually be out there somewhere, waiting. And in the real history, the promise comes true. She does find them. She does sail with them. And at the very end, when they burn a flag rather than lose her, she finally learns that Saul was telling the truth all along, that there really was a sea full of people glad she was born, and that she had finally, after all those years, found them. The promise is kept in the real history at enormous cost, across an enormous distance of suffering. Saul gives a drowning child something to hold on to, and she holds on to it through hell, and it turns out to be real. It is one of the most beautiful arcs in the whole story precisely because the promise is made in the light and kept in the dark, because a kind giant tells a lonely girl a hopeful thing on a good day, and then she has to carry that hope through 20 years of the world doing everything in its power to prove it false, and at the very end the hope wins. That is what makes it land, not the promise, but the distance the promise survives. In this telling, the promise is kept differently and more gently, and this is the strange part, maybe less completely. Because the imagined Robin does not have to carry Saul's promise through 20 years of darkness, since there are no 20 years of darkness to carry it through. She does not spend her life half believing and half despairing that a sea full of people who would be glad she was born might be out there somewhere. She does not need to, because she already has, right there on her own island, a smaller version of exactly that. People who are glad she was born, her mother, her fellow scholars, the young people of Ohara who, over the years, stop fearing her and start being her friends. The promise Saul made comes true in this telling not as a distant sea finally reached after decades of longing, but as an ordinary fact of an ordinary life. She is simply among people who are glad she exists and has been all along and never has to go looking. The lifeline Saul threw is never needed because the child never falls into the water it was meant to save her from. And there is a real question about whether that is a fuller keeping of the promise or a thinner one. And it is the same question this whole telling keeps asking. Saul promised her a sea full of people who would be glad she was born. The real history gives her that in the grandest possible form, an actual crew, an actual family, chosen at the far end of an actual odyssey, worth more to her precisely because she nearly died without them. This telling gives her the same thing in the smallest possible form. A home, a mother, a few friends, present from the start, never dramatic, never earned through suffering, just quietly, ordinarily there. The grand version is more beautiful. The small version is more merciful. The grand version keeps the promise the way a legend keeps a promise. The small version keeps it the way a normal, happy life keeps a promise, which is so quietly that you might not even notice it has been kept. Saul, wherever he is in this telling, an old giant off toward the far homeland of his kind, laughing his strange, honking laugh, would probably be glad either way. He did not make the promise so that Robin would have a legendary arc. He made it so that a lonely little girl would have something to hold on to and someone someday glad she was born. In this telling, she has that on the very first night in her own home, with her mother in the next room. The giant kept his promise. He just didn't have to throw it as far. Let us step back from the story itself for a little while, gently, the way you might set a book face down on your chest to think about what you have just read, and ask the quiet question underneath the whole exercise. Why tell it at all? Why sit for 2 hours inside an imagined version of a tragedy, rewinding a fire that, in the real story, we all know perfectly well still burned? It is not really because we want a different story. The people who love the tragedy of Ohara, and it is one of the most loved and most wept over sequences in the entire saga, love it precisely because of how completely it works. The fire, the mother's choice, the giant frozen laughing, the little girl drifting away with an impossible bounty, and then, 20 years later, the tearful scream that she wants to live. It is devastating exactly as written, and nobody who loves it would actually want the author to go back and unwrite it. To rewind it is not to reject it. It is something gentler and stranger than that. It is what happens when a story hurts you so precisely and so well that the grief it leaves behind doesn't quite drain away when the chapter ends, and some tender part of you goes looking, quietly, for somewhere else to put the feeling. That is what a telling like this one actually is, underneath the alternate history machinery. It is not a claim that the real story got anything wrong. It is a place to put grief that the real story by design was never going to resolve. A small, safe room built entirely out of the words, "Just this once, let it have gone differently," where the rules of the world can bend exactly far enough to let you sit with a little girl a little longer than the real story allowed, and give her back the mother it took, and watch her grow up without ever once pretending that this room is the same as the real world outside it. The real Ohara still burned. The real Olvia still chose the fire. The real Robin still drifted away alone. Nothing about tonight argues otherwise or wants to. What tonight offered instead was somewhere else to stand for a while. A version built specifically to hold the exact shape of the loss you already know by heart and turn it gently 1 degree toward mercy. And there is a reason this particular tragedy invites it so strongly, out of all the losses in a story full of them. Ohara is a tragedy about a child and about knowledge and about a world so afraid of the truth that it would rather burn a library full of gentle people than let the past be remembered. Those are the kinds of losses that leave a specific kind of ache. Not the clean grief of a warrior's noble death, but the sick, helpless grief of watching cruelty fall on people who did nothing but want to know things and love each other and read. That ache doesn't resolve into anything triumphant because there is nothing triumphant about it. It just sits, and a telling like this one is a way of tending it, of saying, for 2 quiet hours, what if the gentle people had lived? What if the child had kept her mother? What if the truth had survived not as a wound in one hunted survivor, but as a secret held in common by a whole community who got to grow old keeping it? It doesn't fix anything. It isn't supposed to. It is just a way of being kind to a grief that the real story, magnificently, refused to be kind to. Maybe that is the whole quiet use of a story like this, the reason the shape of it. Imagine the worst thing and then imagine it going gently instead. Keeps working across so many different beloved tragedies and so many different sleepless nights. It lets you practice a very specific and very human kind of hope, the hope that a devastating loss might have gone otherwise, held at exactly enough distance that you know the entire time that it didn't, and can set it down again gently when you are done, instead of needing it to be true in order to keep going. That is not a small thing to offer a person at the end of a long day. It might, in its own quiet way, be one of the kindest things that stories are for. Not to lie to us about what happened, but to sit with us in the ache of it and imagine just for a couple of hours a world 1 degree more merciful than the one we actually got. Let us close the story portion of tonight with one small invented scene, imagined whole cloth the way everything since the divergence has been, but worth picturing slowly because sometimes a whole reimagined life comes to rest in a single quiet image. Picture Ohara, many years after the raid that did not become an erasure. It is evening. The occupation is still there, in the way that a scar is still there long after the wound has closed. A marine post at the edge of town, a censor's list of what the library may and may not hold, a permanent low awareness on the whole island that they are watched and always will be. But it is an ordinary evening, and ordinary evenings, even under occupation, are mostly made of small, unremarkable things. And in the great tree of knowledge, diminished, half-empty where the best books were seized, but still standing, still alive, still putting out leaves over the heads of the people beneath it, there is a lamp lit at a table, and there is a woman reading. She is grown now, the little girl from the beginning. Long, dark hair, calm blue eyes, a scholar's stillness about her. She is reading something old and harmless, the kind of text the censors long ago decided was safe, and she is not hunted, and she is not afraid, and there is no bounty on her head, and no one on any sea is coming for her tonight or any night. An older woman sits across from her, working through a page of her own. Her mother, gray now, still carrying somewhere behind her eyes the old guilt of a leaving decades gone, but present as she has been present for every ordinary evening of her daughter's life since the night the island didn't burn. They do not talk much. They have long since reached the stage of closeness where 2 people can sit in the same lamplight for an hour without needing to fill it. Every so often one of them reads a line aloud and the other nods or corrects or smiles. That is all. That is the entire scene. There is nothing legendary in it. No crew, no odyssey, no flag burning, no tearful mountaintop scream of finally wanting to live. Just two women reading by a lamp in a wounded library on a watched island at the end of an ordinary day. In the real history, this scene is impossible. One of these women died in a fire when the other was 8, and the survivor spent the next 20 years drifting alone across the sea with the whole world wanting her dead. In this telling, it is the most ordinary thing imaginable, so ordinary that it would never make it into any legend, so ordinary that nobody outside that room would ever think to tell a story about it. And that ordinariness is the whole of the mercy. The real Robin's life is a magnificent tragedy that becomes a magnificent triumph. This one is neither. It is just a life, small, safe, scholarly, shadowed but whole, spent among people who are glad she was born in the home that got to keep standing. If Saul could see it, the old giant, wherever he ended up, laughing his strange, honking laugh somewhere far away, he would understand it immediately because it is exactly what he promised her, delivered in the plainest possible form. Not a sea full of people reached at the far end of a lifetime of longing. Just a mother and a lamp and a book and an evening with nothing terrible in it, and a lonely little girl who got to grow all the way up into a woman who was never once, not for a single night of her life, made to feel she should not exist. He told her there would be people glad she was born. There are. They are sitting right there in the lamplight with her. That was always all he meant, and that is where this telling is content to leave her. Not at a triumph, not at a rescue, not at the end of any grand journey, but in the middle of a quiet evening that the real history burned before it could ever happen. One saved island, one kept mother, one ordinary lamp-lit life going on, unremarkable and safe, in a world that in the real story would never let her have it. It is worth spending a little time on the island itself over the long years after, because Ohara is not only Robin's home and her mother's, it is a community, a whole small society of people. And what happens to a wounded community over time is its own quiet story worth telling. An occupied island does not heal quickly, and it does not heal cleanly, and this telling would be lying to suggest that the years after the raid are anything like the years before it. Something was broken on Ohara that does not unbreak. The scholars who were arrested come back changed, if they come back at all. Some released after years of government imprisonment, older and quieter and more careful. Some never seen again. The great open confidence of the old Ohara, the sense of a community devoted joyfully and unashamedly to knowing forbidden things, is gone, replaced by a wariness that never fully lifts. The library is censored. There are books the island will never be allowed to hold again, subjects that can no longer be studied in the open, a whole vein of the island's old life that now has to happen, if it happens at all, in whispers and in memory. Occupation is a weight, and Ohara carries it, and the weight does not come off. But a community under a weight is still a community, and people are stubborn, and life, given any room at all, tends to grow back into the spaces left for it. The market reopens, the children go back to their lessons in a smaller and more careful school, watched but going. The young people grow up and pair off and have children of their own, and those children grow up on an island that is watched and wary but is still unmistakably home. An island with a great living tree at the center of it, and a long memory and a quiet, shared, unspoken pride in being the place that almost read the truth of the world and lived to keep the memory of it. Over years, the sharpest edges of the trauma dull the way they do. The raid becomes a thing that happened, a grief the whole island carries in common, a date remembered quietly rather than a wound freshly bleeding. The scholars who survive teach the ones who come after, and the knowledge that went underground stays underground but does not die, passed in the old way, from the old to the young, in the pauses between the permitted lessons. There is a particular strength that wounded communities have, if they survive at all, that untouched ones never develop. A closeness, a knowing what matters, a refusal to take the ordinary for granted, that comes only from having nearly lost everything. The Ohara of this telling has that strength. It is a smaller, quieter, more careful place than the Ohara that existed before the raid, but it is also, in some ways, a closer one. A community that looked total erasure in the face, and survived it by the width of a single afternoon's different choice, and never afterward forgets how precious and how fragile the ordinary is. The children of that island grow up knowing, without being able to say quite how, that the quiet, lamplit evenings and the permitted lessons and the unremarkable safety of their days are not guaranteed, were nearly taken, are held onto against a shadow that never fully leaves. And there is a kind of wisdom in growing up that way. Not the wisdom of suffering exactly, but the wisdom of the near miss, the deep knowing of how much an ordinary day is actually worth. Nico Robin grows up inside that wisdom, and it shapes her differently than either the innocence of the pre-raid island or the trauma of the real history would. She is not the untroubled child of a safe and confident Ohara, and she is not the shattered survivor of a burned one. She is something in between, which is maybe the most human thing to be. A person who knows exactly how close the darkness came, who carries the island's shared grief and the island's shared wariness, but who also gets to keep her mother and her home and her name, who lives, in other words, the way most people who have survived something actually live, which is neither untouched nor destroyed, but marked and grateful and going on. That is a real life. It is not a legend, and it is not a tragedy. It is the third thing, the ordinary thing, the thing the real history never let her have, a survivor's life, lived among other survivors on an island that remembers. There is a larger idea underneath this whole story that is worth turning toward before we begin to drift, because it is the thing that makes Ohara resonate far beyond the world it happens in, and it is a gentle enough thought to fall asleep on. Ohara is, at its root, a story about a power that rules by forgetting, and about the small, stubborn people who refuse to forget. The world government's whole authority rests on a hole in history. On 100 years, no one is allowed to remember, on a truth so dangerous that keeping it buried is worth burning libraries and drowning islands. That is a very old kind of power, older than any one story, the power that says, the past is whatever we permit you to remember, and the things we have chosen to erase never happened. And if you go looking for them, we will make you disappear too. It is the power of the people who write the histories, and burn the ones they don't like, and count on the fact that a truth with no one left to remember it is, for all practical purposes, gone. And against that enormous power stand the archaeologists of Ohara, who have no army, no fleet, no weapon of any kind, only patience and curiosity, and an unwillingness to let a thing be forgotten just because forgetting it is safer. That is the entire nature of their rebellion. They do not fight, they remember. They take the erased century and character by character over generations. They write it back into being, not to use it against anyone, but simply because it is true and someone ought to know. It is the quietest possible resistance, and it turns out to be the one the powerful fear most, more than pirates, more than revolutionaries, more than open war. Because you can defeat an army, but you cannot defeat a fact. And a group of people patiently remembering a thing you have staked everything on forgetting is a threat that force cannot fully reach. In the real history, force reaches them anyway. In the crudest way, it burns them. But even there, the remembering wins in the end, barely, carried by a single survivor across 20 years until it finds its way back into the world. And in this telling, the remembering wins more gently and more completely, because the rememberers do not have to die to keep the memory alive. That is the quiet triumph hidden inside this whole imagined mercy. Not that an island was saved, but that a truth was kept by the oldest and most human method there is. A group of people simply refusing to let it go. And there is something in that worth carrying out of the story and into your own quiet, because it is true far beyond any island in any ocean. The things worth remembering are almost never the things power finds convenient. The truest histories are often the buried ones, and the work of keeping a real thing alive against a world that would rather forget it, a real history, a real person, a real love, a real loss, is work that mostly gets done not by armies or governments, but by small groups of stubborn people around lamplit tables, refusing quietly to let it go. Libraries are built by that stubbornness. So are families. So is every true thing that survives longer than the people who first knew it. The scholars of Ohara are just the purest example of the most ordinary kind of quiet heroism there is. The heroism of the people who remember and keep remembering and pass it on, so that a thing that mattered does not vanish simply because the powerful found it inconvenient. You do not have to hold on to any of that tonight, it will keep. But it is a soft thing to drift off on. The thought that somewhere, in some story, on some small island that almost burned, there are two women reading by a lamp, keeping alive a truth the whole world tried to forget. Not because they have to, not because anyone is watching, but simply because it is true, and someone ought to remember, and they have decided that someone will be them. Let us gather the whole shape of it back together now, softly, the way a recap should work. Not new information, just the through line, laid out one more time so it settles as you drift. It begins with a real history, honored exactly as it happened, not softened by a single word. A world that rules by bearing 100 forbidden years. A small island of gentle scholars who spent generations quietly reading that forbidden past back into being. A lonely little girl at the heart of them, the most gifted of them all, with a mother somewhere out at sea and an empty place where a friend should have been. It moves through a warm giant who taught that lonely child to laugh, and a mother racing home across the water carrying a warning and 20 years of guilt, and a government force closing in with orders about to escalate from arrest into erasure. And in the real history, it ends the way we all know it ends. A library burning to the waterline with its keepers still reaching for the pages, a mother choosing the fire, a giant frozen laughing on a beach, and an 8-year-old drifting away alone into 20 years of being hunted and betrayed and told by nearly every mouth she met that she should never have been born. And then it finds the one seam in that real history where things came within minutes of going otherwise. The moment when a raid became an erasure, triggered by the discovery of how much Ohara truly knew and the confirmation of it spoken aloud. And it changes exactly that. A warning reaches the scholars a little sooner. The deepest knowledge is hidden before it can be found. An old professor swallows the truth instead of speaking it, and saves his island by making it look harmless. And the fleet, lacking the proof that erasure was necessary, chooses to cage Ohara instead of drowning it. Everything after that one changed. Afternoon is imagined, and this telling stayed honest about the line. The island survives, occupied and watched and wounded, but alive. Professor Clover lives, a prisoner, having traded his grand defiant gesture for his people's survival. The scholars mostly live, scattered and caged, carrying the forbidden knowledge out of the fire in the one place no fleet can reach, inside their own memory. The giant does not freeze. His warning is the very thing that saves the day. And he carries his strange laugh off toward home. And the little girl keeps her mother, and her home, and her name, and her ordinary loneliness that gets the years it needs to slowly, ordinarily heal. She grows up a scholar among scholars, safe, unhunted, glad of, and she never once in her life has to scream that she wants to live, because no one ever teaches her that she shouldn't. And the telling stayed honest too about the cost, because a mercy this large is never pure gain. The Robin who grows up loved on a surviving island is not the extraordinary, scarred, hard-wonly, alive woman the fire would have made. She may never become a fugitive, never join a crew of dreamers, never be the one key a family needed to reach the end of the world, never earn the shattering relief of finally being told she was allowed to exist. The mercy gives her a mother and a home and an ordinary happy life, and in the very same motion, it quietly unmakes the magnificent, broken, beloved person that only the suffering could have created, and the family that person would have found. Both are real, the mercy is real, and the cost is real, and they are the same act seen from two sides. None of it resolves into a triumph, and that restraint was the whole point. The void century stays unspoken. The government still rules, the wider world barely shifts. What changes is small and human and enormous all at once. One gentle island not erased, one truth kept alive in living memory instead of drowned in fire, and one lonely little girl who got to grow all the way up in her own home with her mother in the next room. That is the whole shape of the what if. Not a rewritten world, just one terrible afternoon, sitting right beside one quiet mercy, close enough to touch. That is where we will leave this one. Not at a triumph, because triumph was never what tonight was for. Not at a rescue or a battle won or a secret finally spilled into the light. Just somewhere quieter and warmer than the real story allowed. A library that didn't burn, a mother who didn't die, a little girl who got to keep her home and grow up slowly inside it, glad of, unhunted, safe. The real Ohara still burned. Nothing tonight pretended otherwise, not for a single moment. The real Robin still drifted away alone, still carried her 20 years of dark, still earned, at the very end, the hard and beautiful right to say she wanted to live. All of that is still true, still waiting, still exactly as devastating as it has always been. Tonight was just a couple of quiet hours spent 1 degree to the side of it, imagining the gentler road, the afternoon where a few minutes went differently and an island lived. You do not have to remember any of it, not the names, not the order, not which choice changed what. If you are already half gone, drifting somewhere between the words, then you are exactly where you were always meant to end up by now. This was never built to be studied, only walked through once, slowly, on your way somewhere quieter. Let the last hour or two settle and fade the way a story is supposed to fade when his only real job was to keep you company until you no longer needed the company. Wherever you are tonight, whatever weight you carried into this dark with you, let it be like the island for a little while. Watched over, wounded maybe, but still standing, still holding on to the things that matter, still here. The world that rules by forgetting will still be there in the morning, and so will all its real and unbending history, exactly where you left it. But for now, in this quiet, you get to imagine the mercy instead. A library that didn't burn, a mother in the next room, a lamp still lit at a table, and someone reading softly, keeping a true thing alive, simply because it is true and someone ought to remember. Rest now. Ohara will keep until morning. You are in good company tonight, a whole island of quiet people who never stopped remembering, and one little girl who finally, in this telling, got to simply grow up safe. Sleep well. The truth will wait for you. It has waited 800 years already. It can wait through 1 good night's rest.